Growing up a child in the 90s and a teenager in the early 2000s, I know that wasn't that long ago. We use some interesting phrases like gnarly or radical as words to describe a daring or extreme act of athleticism. For instance, I used to be a pretty big wakeboarder. I don't know if some of you may not know what a wakeboard is. A wakeboard is basically someone who's it's like a snowboard only behind a boat, where you're out there on the water. And so while we were out there wakeboarding, if I or a friend would land a big jump out there, our cool boat driver would say something like, "Dude, that was a gnarly jump," or "That was radical, man." Now, I haven't heard too many negative uses of the word gnarly, but today, to be called radical makes people think in a different connotation. Some think terrorist, and some think elitism or racism. Because we're living in a society that feels it's necessary to label everything and everyone, being painted a radical or an extremist can often discredit someone's entire identity, especially in regards to someone's politics or, more importantly, within their faith. Now, as faithful Seventh-day Adventist Christians, living every day as another day closer to the coming of Christ, you should know whether you hold extreme views or not, or participate in extreme activities or practices or not, that label of extremist will more than likely be said about you one day. And you know what? That's okay. If living in faithfulness as a response to God's love for us and our love for Him makes us radical or extreme, I will gladly bear that label. But the negative side, such as hatred or violence or maybe exclusivism, I'm not sure that's the gospel that is alive in us. Today we're actually going to talk about how to live in wisdom, even discover what extreme wisdom looks like. Before we go any further, though, can we bow our heads and offer a word of prayer? Father in heaven, Lord, thank you so much for being with us. And Lord, I pray that you would be with each one of us in our hearts, and that our hearts would be open to receive your message, Lord. Thank you for the knowledge that you are with us. In Jesus' name, amen. If you have your Bibles, I would encourage you to turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes has several themes within its chapters. To some studiers, the author appears to have given up. Depending on the translation you're using when studying, you hear the words vanity and meaningless to describe different life pursuits. Ecclesiastes makes a point of showing that life is perplexing and short. It also illustrates the confusion of life, questioning why the wicked prosper and injustice abounds. The author shows the limitations of wisdom while affirming its importance. Ecclesiastes exposes the utter emptiness of life without God. The pursuits often thought to give life meaning, such as wealth, work, power, knowledge, and pleasure, are all fleeting. They are ultimately poor substitutes for serving God. Likewise, learning cannot result in a meaningful life because there will always be something that doesn't make sense. As the author discovers, self-reliance and reason are deceptive devices. The pain of our struggles with futility and injustice should rightly prompt us to go to God. Now, the book largely talks about the human existence on earth has very little to offer in comparison with what God has in store for those who turn to Him. God is the only one who has anything to offer that is lasting. Now, I give you this introduction to the book so that we can now focus on a passage that totally gave me a paradigm shift my sophomore year in college, which is found in verses 15 through 18 of chapter 7. The author, thought to be Solomon by some or someone else speaking from or about his generation, is at least someone who has lived a full life and seen vanities of all sorts. It says in verse 15, In this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these. The righteous perishing in their righteousness, the wicked living long in their wickedness. Do not be over righteous, neither be over wise. Why destroy yourself? Do not be over wicked, and do not be a fool. Why die before your time? It is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. I was reading from the New International Version. Now, it's a profound message, to say the least. To understand better, we can look back at verse 14, where the author says, there are times that will be joyful, but also days filled with adversity. People should accept both good and bad situations in life, recognizing that they are dependent on God and not simply their circumstances. Verse 18 tells us that fearing God makes us avoid extremes. Yet if you look throughout history, we can think of all too many extreme examples of acts of violence, persecution, and even genocide, all in the name of God. So how can this be true? Now, many would be quick to point out that these examples that come to mind are where people who were acting in God's name were not truly God's servants, but were acting for reasons other than God compelling them. Let's present and summarize the extremes that are listed. We have over righteous and over wise. This leads to self-destruction. And then on the other side, we have over wickedness and foolish living. This also leads to self-destruction, which could have been prevented. Now, logically, you may have questions with these biblical assertions. Now, first off, is there such a thing as being too righteous? Or can someone really be too wise? Those two descriptions seem on the outside as only positive. Now, on the other end, or ditch, one might wonder what the author means by saying not be overly wicked. Is that permission to be somewhat wicked? And then you might wonder again, just simply logically, is the author trying to put us somewhere in the middle? Because that would mean he wants us to be a little righteous and a little wise, but also a little wicked and a little bit the fool. Now, my intention to say all this is to muddy any preconceived notions you may already have about extremes. And the author points out that even the most righteous man or woman perishes. Now, what is being described here is acts of righteousness. I say that because his working definition of someone who is righteous or overly righteous is based upon his or her acts of righteous living, good works, and good deeds. Jesus counseled a young, rich, and by all accounts, righteous man, addressing his question of what more could he do to be saved. Jesus, of course, tells him to give up everything that he has and follow him. Now, while the young man had outwardly done and said all of the right things, he was by all outwardly accounts a righteous man, but Jesus could see beyond the exterior and see what was at his core, and it was not God's Spirit that was driving him. Salvation is not found in legalism or righteous deeds either. Strict adherence to a list of do's and don'ts is not what Christian salvation is about. Romans 3:20 says no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. Now, we all fall short of the glory of God, it says a few verses later. This overly righteous description used in Ecclesiastes can be a symptom of declaring that you have found all the answers. Now, have you ever met a person in your life that is just a little too smart for their own good? You know, that anyone pop into your head when I ask you that question? Because when I think of that question, I think of one of my former classmates at Mount Pisgah. There was this guy whose intelligence was just off the charts. He had no troubles academically. In fact, the teachers had difficulty challenging him. His struggles, though, lied in his ability to cultivate meaningful relationships. He rubbed many people the wrong way because most everything that would come out of his mouth came out condescending. I actually grew to really feel for this guy because I knew he desired to have friendships. But it seemed he couldn't help but make angry even those who were trying to be his friend. He had all the knowledge and academic smarts one could ask for, overly in fact. But I wouldn't call him a truly wise person because he had very little discernment as to what to do with all of that knowledge. But now I would suggest to you, this being overly wise statement that we're talking about isn't any type of wisdom at all, but merely an impostor of wisdom. What that is full of knowledge, but has no sense in deriving purpose of that knowledge. Throughout the book of Ecclesiastes calls such wisdom vanity and meaningless. You can see clearly in chapter 2, verse 15, where he says, "Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity." The author is making a warning against relying on such wisdom and righteousness for prolonged life or happiness. Now that we understand better the danger of this extreme of over-righteous and overly wise attitude found in scriptures that warns, why should you destroy yourself by living in such a way? We now turn to who are more susceptible to this and how they might fall into that particular ditch. Now, while these folks are not the exclusive members of the overly righteous and overly wise extreme, these are some the devil works hard to prey on, trying to lead them down that road. A colleague of mine identifies them as the zealot, the prodigal, and the masterpiece. I'll go on to describe them. First, the zealot. Now, like the name implies, the zealot is someone who is on fire. Usually they're a new believer or have embraced a new belief or idea that they are passionate about. Yet although they are excited about new knowledge, they haven't come to terms with the fact that everyone is on a different path of maturity and growth. Changes that others need to make will seem obvious to them, but will likely annoy those around them. People in this category may also have a strong devotion to the views of the person or ministry which led them to a deeper truth. Now, if you try to point out an inconsistency, they'll likely take that as a personal attack and retaliate, and usually not in the best way. Then we have the prodigal. In the Bible, many people see the prodigal son in Jesus' Luke 15 parable as the younger son who left home and lived a life of debauchery. However, in reality, both the younger as well as the older son, the one who had never left home, were prodigals. Both lived in various levels of alienation from their father. Practically speaking, prodigals may be people who lived an extremely wild life and come back to organized religion. Or they may be people who lived their whole life in a church, but then go a little bit wild once they leave their home full of rules. In both these cases, the pendulum swings to the opposite end, and they tend to fall into the other extreme because of a lack of balance. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the masterpiece. The masterpiece has found their theological sweet spot. In their minds, they've dotted every I and crossed every T. Their goal is not conversation, it's confrontation and conversion to their view. Now, change is almost impossible here without divine intervention, because after all, how can you improve upon a masterpiece that took years, if not decades, to construct? Now, the author of Ecclesiastes, in speaking to this extreme, says, "Why destroy yourself?" The Hebrew word shamam can refer both to destruction and also one's emotional response to destruction. So essentially to be shocked or to be dumbfounded. The person who relies on his or her own wisdom or righteousness for complete happiness and a prosperous life says will ultimately be disappointed. Now, what is missing in many of these people, which I'll expound upon further once we looked at the opposite extreme, is a self-recognition of a need for more of God's grace in their own life, and also their spiritual growth has not peaked, and they still have a journey of learning to do. Now, before we flip to the other extreme, I want to say this. Those who find themselves living in one extreme, there is a danger in quickly flipping to another extreme. Have any of you ever owned one of those labyrinth toys before? Like one of those little boards. I know you probably never heard it described this way, but if you saw one, you'd know exactly what I was talking about. It's one of those boards where you have like the little metal ball in there and you're trying to navigate it through a little maze and it might fall into a hole here or there. Well, if you've ever played with one of those, you know that just the slightest move to the right or to the left, that ball's going to go flying on into the other side and possibly fall into a hole you were not trying to have it go into. I think sometimes it feels that way in our faith life. In our attempts to fix an extreme in our life, we have a tendency to overcorrect for fear of the other extreme. Looking at verse 17, says, "Do not be over wicked and do not be a fool. Why die before your time?" The author is not suggesting by saying, do not be excessively wicked, that there is somehow a permission to be somewhat wicked. But this is a warning against wickedness, while recognizing that wickedness due to sin and our natural inclination for sin, it cannot be fully avoided. He emphasizes this point in verse 20, saying, "Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins." Now, being overly wicked is also being overly foolish. It is in many ways living with knowledge of truth and still choosing to live differently from that exposed truth in your life. Now, consider with me Jesus' parable again of the prodigal son. The one who wandered from the gate of his father elected to receive his inheritance. Foolishly, he quickly squandered it on immoral living and on friends who emotionally may have felt like good friends. But when he found himself needing them, they were nowhere to be seen. This son, I'm sure, had been warned, even raised in a comfortable home. He had likely been educated to what existed outside his father's gates, but had not yet experienced it and was seduced by perceiving it to be glamorous. Parents warn their kids and teenagers what exists beyond their gates, often to protect their innocence, and also because they most often have been there themselves and have experienced it firsthand. Now, I hope no one will be too upset at me for admitting that I've seen a Disney movie or two in my life, and there's one classic I'm sure many of you will remember, and that is Lady and the Tramp. The love story between Lady, the refined, beautiful pet dog, who meets the tramp, who is a stray, free, and cavalier junkyard dog. Ultimately, the tramp eventually comes to appreciate the good life that Lady has. This brings me to the just awful, lesser-known sequel to the classic, which was Lady and the Tramp 2. It didn't hold a candle to the original, but the storyline almost mirrors the story of the prodigal son. Lady and Tramp's male pup, who resembles his father, sees his father as a coward, thinking he doesn't know what it's like to be a junkyard dog. Now, little does he know his father knows all too well and is ultimately trying to protect his pup from having to learn the lessons the hard way about running from dog catchers and looking for food. Those that I know who turn to a life of sin sometimes blame their parents for squeezing too tight and not allowing them to do this or that. And you know what? Sometimes they're correct. It might have been a contributing reason for their rebellion. But I also know many, and more so in this case, who rebelled against their parents who were not living in any sort of extreme. Those that have made their return back to the Christian walk don't attribute their wandering from their parents who squeezed too hard or little. They say, I knew what I was doing was wrong in that moment, but I was choosing to do it anyways. In those moments they wandered, They knew about God, but had not learned to fear him and have respect for his sovereignty. They are openly admitting that they have acted foolish. Being told of folly and the results of acting foolishly is often not enough, and unfortunately, many learn these lessons the hard way. This rejection of God, or maybe just simply a family religious tradition, may not even be what the author is referring to by being overly wicked or foolish. It may also be referring to a cavalier attitude towards faith. It may not be that they reject God at all, but choose to make up their own principles for following him. In Genesis 4, we learn of the brothers Cain and Abel. Abel brought forth a living sacrifice to God, but Cain brought his choice of sacrifice, which came from the soil. Cain understood what God expected of him, but he thought himself wiser and turned out to be the foolish one. He chose to do something which was foolish, which ultimately led to build a resentment for Abel and God himself. Now, like the opposite extreme, we want to know what factors can contribute to someone embracing an overly wicked and foolish extreme. I have three groups who carry attributes the devil seeks to exploit and cast into this extreme. The ignorant ignoramus, the prodigal two, and the freedom fighter. I'll start with the ignorant ignoramus. Now, they say ignorance is bliss, but I'm not sure that is completely true. This is someone who is ignorant to his own shortcomings. She believes they have all the knowledge they need to survive, but they soon find out how clueless they are to navigate the devil's temptations and seductions. They can often be entrapped by the devil, but be completely unaware of the devil's stronghold over them. While they aren't always the ones who have gone off the deep end, per se, they allow smaller evils in and not comprehending their damaging effects. There are ignorant ignoramuses within every generation of people. Then we have the prodigal two. There is a prodigal in both extremes, and the brothers of the parable, the prodigal son, represent them well. Prodigals are susceptible to being resentful. While the story of the prodigal son demonstrates the love of the father to accept back his son who has wandered, we know full well that not every wanderer comes back home. Maybe out of pride or stubbornness, even when some perceive they took a wrong turn, they choose to remain lost and figure it out themselves. And then lastly, the freedom fighter. This is also better known as the rebel. While a prodigal often waits to come of age to wander, the freedom fighter wants to assume responsibility without yet understanding the consequences of actions. They can speak from a supposed moral seat, but lack the vision to see the full spread picture. Their picture of God isn't a picture of God at all, but oftentimes a picture of a Christian zealot, which we described earlier. And because they have a false picture of God, they choose to rebel. Now, all three extremes that I've mentioned, whether they be from the wise side or the foolish side, are ones I hope none of us seek to implement in our lives. The problem, though, with extremes is that when we are living in either of the extremes, most of us are not convicted that we're living in an extreme. And if we're living in an extreme, are we simply to just move to somewhere in the middle? It sounds simple enough, right? Well, the text does not suggest there is a middle between the two, as we often picture, but what does it actually say? It says, whoever fears God avoids all extremes. The person who fears God recognizes the limitation of human wisdom and righteousness, while also being aware of the results of wickedness and folly. It's not the center of the two, it's in an entirely different place. Now, what is missing in all of these personalities that I have described? Now, I said it before, it is growth and grace. To say it biblically, it's growing in grace. Behind every extremist is a closed-minded, self-righteous spirit that believes it has arrived at truth with a capital T. C.S. Lewis shared his thoughts in his classic Mere Christianity. It says, "For pride is spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love or contentment or even common sense." Pride is the root to extremes. We have to be willing to accept our brokenness. When we accept our brokenness and admit where sin exists in our life, we are willingly asking God to help shape us and chisel out the spots that need to be gone. In the opening of this message, I told you we would be talking about wisdom and how to find and live in extreme wisdom. It's acknowledging true wisdom doesn't come from our lofty pursuits of living righteously. It also doesn't come from living in wickedness. It comes in admitting we don't have all the answers, but that the God that we serve does hold the answers, does hold the keys. It's being like Solomon and asking God for more wisdom. It's being like Peter and praying for God's power in boldness. It's acknowledging, like the author of Ecclesiastes, that nothing this world has to offer, no joy this world brings, no lust of the flesh, and no righteous act will bring us the riches of what God has in store for those who follow after him and cling to him while living in such a sinful world. There is beauty in reverently fearing God. And like the scripture says, in doing so, we can avoid all extremes. Our closing hymn today is number 522, "My Hope is Built on Nothing Less." And before we go any further, do we have anyone here who knows any of our guests play the piano at all? We are missing a pianist. If someone would like to play.